Well, hi, Stu Amy coming to you from Pawleys Island, South Carolina. Twice in my life I've had the opportunity to go to Vienna, Austria to see the Lippenzaner horses. This is a part of the Spanish riding school. It was established in 1580, and these horses do amazing things. They're huge horses, but they do amazing things. The thing that always stuns me is that they're actually able to stand still and jump and lift all four legs off the ground. So the last time I was watching them a couple months ago when Susan and I were in Austria, in Vienna, was we saw them training the horses, and then we saw the actual show and presentation. Again, 1580, this whole school was established to train these horses. I noticed that those trainers, they were watching, if those horses stepped out of line one single time, those trainers were uncompromising in pulling those horses back to what they were supposed to be doing. There was a focus about that, a training about that, a discipline about that. They were absolutely uncompromising. Those horses could not waver out of their boundary lines. So, I've been introducing Paul to you by way of an acronym, letters of the alphabet that represent ideas that are easy to remember. And here's the acronym that I don't think you'll ever forget. Hopefully you'll remember it for the rest of your life. P for Paul the Polluted, A for Paul the Apostle. We had two messages on that. Hope you listened to that second message especially. U, we're going to talk about today, Paul the Uncompromising. And then in the next message, L, Paul the Loving. So let's look at Paul the Uncompromising, the never compromising. He never let the truth of the gospel get one step out of line. He was always correcting it and pulling it back together. Paul had been beaten, imprisoned, shipwrecked, exhausted, but he believed to the end, and he was uncompromising to the end of his life when it came to the truth of the gospel. Now, remember, uncompromising doesn't mean unloving. I like to look at it this way: uncompromising, therefore loving. When I was in seminary on Sunday mornings, I joined a softball team in the local community in Ipswich, Massachusetts, where I was at Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary. It was a league that played on Sunday mornings, and there were beer kegs. It was a beer league. And I remember my fellow seminarians just criticizing me for playing softball on Sunday morning. So I went to a professor that I really, really respected, Elizabeth Leach. And I went to her and I said, what am I supposed to do here? Do I get to know these guys in the community and have a great time with them and play softball? Or do I drop out like everybody wants me to and conform to the system? And she said, don't compromise who you are. Be uncompromising in who you are. At the same time, you have to be willing to lay down your life for those who criticize you. And that was Paul, uncompromising, but always loving. And it causes me to ask the question, where does God want me to be uncompromising in the truth of the gospel of God, the truth of God, yet lay down my life for those who criticize me? So let's take a look at Paul, who was never compromising, but always loving in his ability and willingness to lay down his life for those who criticized him. Now remember, for the first 15 years of Christianity was basically a Jewish sect in Jerusalem and in Judea until Paul arrived. It never really spread. They couldn't, because they didn't speak the Latin language or the Greek language fluently, the high classical language. They didn't have a passport like Paul had as a Roman citizen. So the gospel really never spread for the first 15 years, I'm rounding that off, of Christianity. Then Paul arrives on the scene, and in 10 short years, between 47 and 57 AD, he spreads the gospel to the whole known world, to the Gentiles, all because of one man. 10 years, 10,000 mouths. And this man is uncompromising in God's truth, but willing to lay down his life in love for those around him. So one of the most dramatic events that takes place in those 10 years early on is an event, a confrontation in the New Testament. The most dramatic confrontation we find in the New Testament. And it's between the two great leaders of Christianity, Peter, the fisherman from Galilee, and Paul, the prior Pharisee, citizen of Rome, able to speak Latin and Greek and Hebrew. Let's take a look at that story. Galatians chapter 2, verse 11. But when Cephas came to Antioch, I opposed him to his face because he stood condemned. Cephas, that's his Aramaic name. Jesus gave him the name Petros, in the Greek, rock. But his Aramaic name is Cephas. He's a Hebrew fisherman from Galilee, uneducated, just working with his hands, toiling to catch fish, uneducated Palestinian Jew. Now he goes to Antioch. Antioch, the Roman capital of Syria, 380 miles north of Jerusalem. It's Paul's headquarters. It's the place of the first Gentile church. It's known for its Greek culture and religion and gods, and Peter goes to visit there. But Paul says, I had to oppose him there face to face. I had to square off in public. This is one of the most dramatic moments in the New Testament. The two great leaders of the church, the heavyweights, are going to get in the ring and duke it out. The two leading apostles square off. Now, Peter's story is the first half of the book of Acts. Did you ever think of Acts that way? The first half is Peter's leadership. The second half is Paul's. Now, they collide here in Galatians. It's the only place in the New Testament where we find the apostles confronting each other publicly. One the rock, the other the convert. At stake, the church, the gospel, Christ, the truth of God. And Paul tells us that Peter stood condemned. He stood in the wrong. His actions had condemned him. He was not being the rock, he was being Peter the coward. He had that trait in him. Remember in the courtyard on the evening of prior to the crucifixion, Peter just caved to his fears and his anxieties. And here again, he's doing the same caving. He's not living consistently. Peter's actions are not consistent with his beliefs. He is doing something that makes an addition to the gospel that Jesus had preached. He's adding something onto it. His actions, his behavior is not reflecting the belief and the truth of God. You know the word courtesy, it comes from the medieval French word court etiquette. When a knight would come into the courtroom of a king, he would bow. And that bowing, that mannerism, that action was the collective social convention and wisdom of the ages. It communicated all kinds of things about reverence and humility and allegiance. Every action is an indication of something we value and believe. And here, Peter's gone crazy. When someone with the stature of Peter departs from what Christ has revealed as the truth of God, Paul gets angry. Peter is compromising the truth of God, and Paul can't stand to compromise the truth of the gospel. He is uncompromising when it comes to the truth of God. So what's he doing? Well, Paul tells us in Galatians 2:12, for before certain men came from James, he ate with the Gentiles. But when they came, he drew back and separated himself, fearing the circumcision party. What's going on here? Well, in the Council of Jerusalem, early on in the church, they had a dramatic breakthrough. This is coming around the time of Paul. And they decided that it was okay for believers to eat with the Gentiles, to eat Gentile food, that the gospel was also for the Gentiles. And Peter, a Jew, was now permitted to eat with the Gentiles. This was a big breakthrough for the church. Hey, maybe our message is not just for a Jewish sect or Jewish people. Maybe it's for the Gentiles as well. And then in Acts 10 in Caesarea, Peter is on a roof and God sends him a sheet from heaven with all kinds of animals on it that he's not permitted to eat. And God says to him, rise and eat. These animals, this meat, is no longer unclean. 3 times Peter refuses to eat. He said, I can't do that. I'm a Jew. And 3 times God says, rise, Peter, and eat. It's okay. Now what's happening here? Well, until certain men came. Who are the certain men? The circumcision party. Who are the circumcision party? They're the Judaizers that are always trying to get after Paul and bring Moses and the Old Testament ceremonial laws back into the picture of the New Testament truth of God and the gospel. And the early church, the Council of Jerusalem, said that the Gentiles do not need to convert to Judaism. They don't have to conform to the ceremonial laws, the dietary laws. They're free from that. The gospel is now for all people. But when the Judaizers, those who were saying, no, anyone who's a convert, any Gentile, has to convert to all of the ceremonial and dietary laws of the Old Testament. And when they came, and Peter knew what they were going to tell him, Peter, you're not adhering to the ceremonial and dietary laws of the Old Testament. When they came, he stepped back. He withdrew. He was afraid. He separated himself from the Gentiles. And that was a big mistake, and Paul was going to call him for that. You know, things in and of themselves are meaningless. When I was back in Pittsburgh in my early days of ministry, I was doing chapel services for the Pittsburgh Pirates, and I remember Barry Bonds. Barry was an amazing talent, and one time he gave me his bat. I still have it, the baseball bat from Barry Bonds that he'd used in a game. And it was interesting. I was thinking about that bat. A bat, in and of itself, is just a baseball bat. What matters is what we do with it. You can hit a home run with it, or you can hit somebody over the head with it. And that's the same with food. In and of itself, it's insignificant. It's meaningless. It's what we do with it. And Peter saw this as a moment to yield to the pressure, again, the coward Peter, of like the night prior to the crucifixion. He was willing to step back. He was afraid. And in doing so, Paul realized he was contradicting the truth of the gospel, that there were no longer ceremonial or dietary laws that the Gentiles needed to conform to. All they needed to do was come to Jesus in faith and trust in him for their salvation. Galatians 2:13, and with him the rest of the Jews acted insincerely, so that even Barnabas was carried away by their insincerity. You see, to Paul was saying, your compromise, Peter, is influence other people. The rest of the Jews, including Barnabas. The result of your action was that it had a consequence. Others are following you. You're taking everyone else with you. Interestingly, Paul uses that word insincerity. Insincerity. In the Greek, it's hypocrite, actor, Hippocrates. Public actors playing, acting, pretending to be someone else. You're giving the message that you were just play acting with the truth of the gospel, the truth of God, that now all we need to do is trust in Jesus Christ. Yeah, was that an act? You're being a hypocrite. You can't do that, because here's the problem. Other people are following you when you do that. They're following your actions. I love the Civil War. I've been a student of that most of my life. I don't love the Civil War, but I love to be a student of that and study the people there. Stonewall Jackson, June 1861. The Battle of Bull Run, Manassas. Everybody was fleeing from the southern side. They were getting their tails kicked in big time, and so they were running. And then Jackson stops, and he takes his horse to the top of the hill, and he stands there facing the enemy. While people are running past him, the Southern soldiers are running past him. And all of a sudden, one of them said, look, it's Jackson. He's standing there like a stone wall. And it was his actions that turned the complete battle around. And men then began to gather around him and then in front of him and behind him. And they fought that battle and they won. His actions are what influenced people. And Paul's saying, Peter, when you yield, everyone else follows you. Set the example. You want people to say, if he can do it, so can we. If he can do away with the Judaizers and all those Old Testament laws, so can we. We're not bound by that. But when you conform to them, when you cower to the Judaizers, then we say, well, if he does it, then we should do it as well. Peter set the example. We influence people with every action. The people around us, we influence them with every action in our lives. And it causes me to ask the question, who am I influencing this very moment? By what I do, by my actions. Okay, let's wrap this up. Verse 14, but when I saw, that is Paul, that they were not straightforward about the truth of the gospel, I said to Cephas before them all, if you, though a Jew, live like a Gentile and not like a Jew, how can you compel the Gentiles to live like Jews? To Paul, your compromise is influencing other people. And secondly, to Paul, your compromising is a question of the truth. I heard the rumors that you were compromising the truth of the gospel, the truth of God, but I wanted to see for myself. The truth of the gospel, Peter, is Jesus and nothing else. Just grace. Jesus and nothing. Grace alone. Faith alone. Christ alone. Not ceremonial laws. Not dietary laws. We're not bound by them. We're not saved by the law, Peter. We're not saved by what we do, Peter, which is what your actions are saying. We're saved by grace. This is the great principle. This is the truth of the gospel. This is what is at stake. Peter, how can you ask Gentiles to live like Judaizers under the Old Testament ceremonial dietary laws? How can you ask them to live as if it's salvation by the law? That's the Old Testament, Peter. By what we eat. Peter, you're condemning yourself. You're causing questions about the truth of God, about the truth of salvation, about the truth of the gospel. Peter, every action is a reflection of what we believe about God's truth. You're showing someone what to do by your actions. You're showing people how to believe, what you believe. Faith is active. It's an action. It's something I do. And you're doing something that is confusing and influencing people and threatening the truth of the gospel of God. And so, Peter's public compromise to Paul required a public confrontation. Peter, what are you doing? Are you crazy? Peter, it's a question of your belief under pressure, under influence by the Judaizers. I mean, we all have wavering points, breaking points, don't we? We do. Where we cave in because we're afraid of what other people think. And we could just go through a whole laundry list of those kinds of actions in our lives. I know I do. And Peter's already shown his tendency to waver and cave in and compromise. He denied Jesus 3 times. This is his flat side. This is his weakness. So Paul is calling his beliefs and his actions into question. Don't compromise them. Be uncompromising, Peter, in your actions, but always loving towards people. So where is our behavior not matching our belief? We don't want to be Peters, where we cave in under pressure. Where do we compromise our lives? Remember, Jesus died on the cross for us to trust in the truth of God, not in the fake, not in what's added on to salvation. He died for us to trust in the truth of God. Silence may be golden, but it's not always true. And when it comes to belief and action, Paul was uncompromising in his willingness to speak out to those who were compromising the truth of God. In truth, uncompromising. In love, willing to lay down his life for others. What a great message for you and for me. In truth, uncompromising. In love, willing to lay down our lives for others. And that's what we're going to talk about in the last message in this series. Never compromising, but always loving. I want to talk to you about what the love of Paul, what the love of a believer looks like. And I'll see you then.